At my brother's graduation celebration, my parents raised their glasses and proclaimed to the only child who ever made us proud. Laughter erupted around the room, except for my husband, who casually rummaged through his bag. Interesting, because you were more than happy to cash his checks, he said, and the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The warm glow of fairy lights danced across the backyard, casting soft golden hues over the meticulously arranged tables, the carefully placed decorations, and the sea of smiling faces gathered for Jake's graduation party. Laughter bubbled from various corners of the yard, the sound of clinking glasses mingling with the low hum of conversation, creating an atmosphere of celebration that should have felt comforting. Instead, it made Mia feel like an outsider at her own family gathering. She stood near the drink table, fingers tightening around the delicate stem of a champagne flute, her forced smile hiding the tension knotting in her stomach as she watched her parents take center stage. They raised their glasses high in the air, exuding that familiar air of authority they had always carried. Laura and Mark, her parents, had always made their approval feel just out of reach. They cleared their throats, commanding silence without needing to ask for it. The guests, a mix of extended family friends, and Jake's classmates, turned their attention toward them with eager anticipation, their eyes shining with admiration as if the people about to speak had never uttered a cruel word in their lives. Mia already knew what was coming before the words even left their lips, but knowing didn't lessen the impact when they finally spoke to Jake. Their voices carried across the crowd, rich with pride and certainty, to the only child who ever made us proud. The moment the words left their mouths, laughter erupted throughout the party, a ripple of amusement spreading among the guests like a perfectly delivered punchline at a comedy show. The sound scraped against Mia's skin like sandpaper, the bitter sting of humiliation settling deep in her chest, suffocating and relentless. She felt the eyes of distant relatives flick toward her, some shaking their heads with small knowing smirks, others openly chuckling at her expense, as if her role as the family disappointment was some long-established inside joke they all shared. Mia took a slow sip of champagne, the bubbles fizzing bitterly on her tongue, willing herself not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply those words cut. She had spent years mastering the art of swallowing her pain, pretending not to care, forcing herself to believe that their approval was unnecessary. Yet, standing there, drowning in the deafening sound of their laughter, she felt like a little girl again, desperately seeking validation that would never come. But not everyone was laughing. Sarah, her wife, stood beside her, her expression carefully neutral, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with an edge of something sharp and calculating. Unlike Mia, Sarah had never been one to let things slide, never one to let disrespect go unanswered, especially when it came to Mia. Mia felt it before she even saw it, the shift in Sarah's stance, the slow, deliberate way she reached into her bag, fingers brushing against the neatly folded papers she had been holding onto for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And this, it seemed, was that moment. Interesting, Sarah's voice rang out, calm but laced with something cold and deadly beneath the surface. The laughter around them began to wane, the attention in the room shifting like a slow-moving wave turning toward the storm forming on the horizon. Mia turned toward her, her breath catching as she saw the stack of crisp white papers now held in Sarah's grasp, the unmistakable print of bank statements glaring up from the pages. Because you were more than happy, Sarah continued, her gaze settling on Mark and Laura with a casual kind of challenge, to cash his checks. The words sliced through the air like a blade, silencing the remaining laughter in an instant. The energy in the room shifted so fast it was almost suffocating, the once lively party now suspended in intense, stunned silence. Mia watched as her parents' confident smirks flickered, their grip on their champagne glasses tightening just enough to make the liquid inside tremble. Guests exchanged puzzled looks, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in as whispers began to stir at the edges of the gathering. Mia could feel the collective confusion, the growing realization that something far more significant than a poorly worded toast was unraveling before their eyes. Her parents sat frozen at the head table, their lips pressed into thin lines, their carefully applied makeup doing little to hide the way their mouths twitched with barely contained panic. Jake, the golden child, shifted uneasily in his seat, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with something that looked suspiciously like dread. For the first time in years, Mia wasn't the one feeling small, wasn't the one drowning in the weight of their judgment, and it was only just beginning. The girl looked like she had just swallowed glass, her face pale and unreadable as she stared at the documents with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something dangerously close to recognition. But Mark and Laura, ever the master manipulators, didn't miss a beat. Their expressions shifted almost imperceptibly as they let out another forced chuckle, shaking their heads again as if they couldn't believe they even had to entertain this nonsense. "Oh, come on," Mark said, his voice a careful blend of exasperation and amusement, the same tone he had used on Mia when she was a child, trying to make her feel ridiculous for ever daring to challenge them. "Mia, sweetheart," Laura continued in the same vein, "tell me you're not actually going to let her ruin this night over something so petty. After everything we have done for you, after all the sacrifices we made to give you the opportunities that got you where you are today, you're really going to sit there and act like you didn't owe us something in return?" And there it was, the script flipped, the classic manipulation that Mia had spent her entire life trying to outrun. The same tired narrative drilled into her since childhood, that she was only successful because of them, that every dollar she had earned, every milestone she had achieved, was somehow their doing, and that she should be grateful instead of questioning what was rightfully hers. Mia felt the familiar sting of rage bubbling beneath the surface, a lifetime's worth of resentment clawing its way up her throat, threatening to spill over. But before she could find the words to respond, Sarah spoke again, her voice sharper this time, colder, cutting through her parents' defenses like a blade. "That's an interesting way to put it," Sarah said, arching a brow as she glanced at Mia, gauging her reaction before turning back to Mark and Laura. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks less like sacrifices and more like straight-up theft. Mia's been unknowingly funding your lifestyle while you've been running around pretending she's some kind of disappointment. So tell me, how long have you been stealing from her?" The question hit the room like a wrecking ball, the last of the murmurs dying down as every eye turned back to Mark and Laura, waiting for their response, waiting to see how they would weasel their way out of this one. Mia, her heart pounding in her chest, felt the scales finally begin to tip, felt the first crack in her parents' carefully constructed facade begin to show. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to see what happened when the mask finally shattered. The air in Mia's home office was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and paper, the harsh glow of her desk lamp illuminating the chaos of bank statements, credit reports, and financial records scattered across her desk like the wreckage of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents, her eyes scanning the numbers and dates with a sickening sense of realization settling deep in her stomach, an unease so profound it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss she could never climb out of. What had started as a desperate attempt to understand how much of her money had been funneled into her parents' bank accounts had now spiraled into something much worse, something she hadn't even considered possible. Her parents hadn't just been stealing from her business, they had been using her very identity to line their pockets with loans she never knew existed. She could feel the blood draining from her face as she came across the first instance of fraud, her own social security number printed in black ink at the top of a loan application from nearly 6 years ago, the same year she had taken out her first business loan, the same year she had struggled to keep her company afloat while wondering why every bank seemed hesitant to approve her for additional credit. She had blamed herself back then, assuming she had miscalculated something, assuming she had done something wrong. But now she knew the truth, she had never stood a chance because someone else had been leeching off her financial credibility, using her name to secure money she never saw a dime of. The betrayal burned through her veins like fire, her fingers gripping the papers so tightly they nearly crumpled under the force of her rage, her pulse hammering in her ears as the weight of a lifetime of manipulation pressed down on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. Mia barely remembered grabbing the documents before storming out of her house, her legs moving on autopilot as she drove toward her parents' home. The streetlights cast eerie shadows on the empty road ahead of her, her mind replaying every moment of her childhood that suddenly made so much more sense. Every time they had dismissed her accomplishments, every time they had laughed off her success as luck, every time they had made her feel like she owed them for the was nothing. He would show them what nothing really felt like. Ethan sat in the dimly lit office of the attorney, the weight of years of betrayal pressing down on him like an iron hand gripping his chest, making it difficult to breathe as he listened to the forensic accountant meticulously break down every instance of theft his parents had committed. The woman sitting across from him, a sharp-eyed professional in an expensive suit, methodically flipped through the thick stack of documents spread out before her, her voice calm but firm as she detailed the depth of Mark and Laura's deception. The sheer audacity of their financial crime sent fresh waves of anger rolling through his body. The numbers were staggering, far worse than he had originally suspected. Each page revealed another thread in the web of fraud his parents had spun around him without him even realizing it, a tangled mess of stolen funds, falsified loan applications, and outright identity theft that had been ongoing for more than 6 years. Sarah sat beside him, her expression unreadable, her fingers interlocked tightly on the desk in front of her. He could see the tension in her jaw, the subtle way her breath deepened each time another figure was added to the ever-growing total of what had been taken from him. It wasn't just about the money, it never had been. Ethan knew he could recover financially if he needed to, but the part that burned deep in his gut, the part that sent fury racing through his veins like poison, was the fact that the people who had stolen from him had done so while tearing him down at every opportunity, belittling his success while secretly living off of it behind his back. "You have more than enough evidence to press charges," the attorney said finally, setting her pen down as she leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Ethan's with a seriousness that sent a small shiver down his spine. "But if you're looking for a way to guarantee maximum legal repercussions, we need to catch them in the act. We need proof that they're still actively stealing from you, not just that they did it in the past." Ethan tapped his fingers against the table, his mind already racing ahead, the wheels turning as a plan began to form in the back of his mind, something sharp and calculated, something that would make Mark and Laura regret every smug, condescending word they had ever spoken to him, every lie they had ever told. A slow smile curled at the edges of his lips as he glanced toward Sarah, his heart pounding with the first real sense of control he had felt in days, maybe even years. Because now he wasn't just reacting, now he was planning. That evening, as he sat across from Mark and Laura in the overly familiar setting of their pristine dining room, the scent of expensive wine and home-cooked food lingering in the air, he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression neutral, even as every instinct in his body screamed at him to get up and leave. They had invited him to talk, which Ethan knew was just a polite way of saying they wanted to manipulate him, to convince him that he was overreacting, to gaslight him into believing that all of this was somehow his fault, that Mark and Laura had every right to take from him because they were his parents and that family, no matter what, always came first. Laura was the first to speak, her voice soft, soothing, carefully rehearsed to sound concerned rather than defensive. Her carefully applied makeup hid whatever traces of guilt she might have felt, though Ethan doubted there was any real remorse behind her carefully chosen words. "Ethan, sweetheart, we just don't understand why you're so upset," Laura said, tilting her head slightly as she reached for Ethan's hand, her touch gentle but insincere, a move designed to soften his resolve. "You know we've always done everything for you, always looked out for you. We never meant any harm." "You were stealing," Ethan cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through the carefully constructed facade of warmth his mother was trying to build. His fingers tightened around the stem of his untouched wine glass. "You were stealing from me, lying to me, using me, and the only reason we're having this conversation is because I finally caught you." Mark scoffed, leaning back in his chair, his expression one of practiced indifference, as if the sheer magnitude of what he had done was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, a minor irritation rather than a life-destroying betrayal. "You're being ridiculous," he said, shaking his head as if Ethan were some foolish child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "You wouldn't have that money if it weren't for the way we raised you, for the sacrifices we made to give you a good life. So yeah, we took a little here and there, but don't act like it wasn't rightfully ours to begin with." Ethan forced himself to smile, to keep the satisfaction from creeping into his corner, scrolling through her phone as if this entire evening was beneath her. He had sent out the invitations under the guise of making amends, playing his role with just enough sincerity to be believable, knowing that if he approached this any other way, Mark and Laura would have refused to show up, instinctively wary of anything that didn't allow them to control the narrative. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Ethan was in control. As he glanced at Sarah, who stood quietly by his side, he felt a rush of reassurance, knowing he wasn't alone in this. His wife had stood by him through every painful revelation, through every moment of self-doubt, and now, as they prepared to pull the final thread from the tangled web of lies his family had spun, he could feel her silent support like an anchor keeping him steady. The sound of the front door opening drew everyone's attention, and for a split second, Ethan saw confusion flash across his parents' faces as a woman in a dark suit stepped inside, a briefcase in one hand, her expression unreadable as she made her way toward the center of the room. The murmurs around them grew quieter as the stranger set her briefcase down, her presence an unexpected disruption to what was supposed to be a warm, intimate gathering. Ethan allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before he finally spoke. "I wanted to bring everyone together tonight because I've realized something," he said, his voice even and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I've spent my whole life being told that family is everything, that no matter what happens, we're supposed to stick together. But I've also learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the same ones who will gut you without a second thought." Laura let out a nervous laugh, the kind that was meant to smooth over tension, but Mark's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his features as he glanced between Ethan and the woman beside him, the pieces already beginning to click into place in his mind. "What is this?" Mark asked, his tone clipped, his usual bravado laced with an edge of unease. "Who the hell is this woman?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, instead turning to the woman in the suit and giving her a slight nod. Without hesitation, she unlatched her briefcase, pulling out a thick folder that she placed on the coffee table in front of them. The room was deathly silent as she opened it, revealing neatly organized documents, each page a carefully compiled piece of evidence, a record of Mark and Laura's financial crimes laid bare for all to see. "My name is Andrea Clark," the investigator introduced herself, her voice calm and professional, betraying none of the damning weight of the information she was about to reveal. "Mr. Carter hired me to investigate financial discrepancies in his accounts, and after weeks of extensive research, we've uncovered undeniable proof of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft, all tied back to two people, Mark and Laura Carter." Mark let out a scoffing laugh, shaking his head as if this were all some elaborate joke, but Ethan could see the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, the way Laura shot him a desperate warning glance as if begging him not to make this worse. "This is ridiculous," Mark said, his voice rising, his attempted indifference beginning to crack. "He's our son. If we took anything, it was for the family. That's not fraud, that's just stealing." Ethan interrupted, his voice cold, cutting off whatever pathetic excuse they were about to offer. "And before you try to spin this into some selfless sacrifice, let's go over a few facts, shall we?" He gestured for Andrea to continue, and the investigator methodically laid out each discovery, each piece of irrefutable proof, her voice steady as she delivered the blows one by one. Mark and Laura hadn't just been skimming from Ethan's accounts, they had been using his name and social security number to take out loans that were still active, meaning he could legally be held responsible for debts he never agreed to. They hadn't lost their business because of unfortunate circumstances, as they had claimed, but because they had drained every last cent into a gambling addiction they had hidden from the family for years. And perhaps most damning of all, Amy's so-called scholarship, the one Mark and Laura had proudly boasted about, had never existed at all. It had been funded entirely by Ethan's stolen money, handed over without his knowledge while they had sneered at him and called him selfish for not doing more. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating as the weight of the truth crashed down around them. Laura's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed mask of maternal concern cracking at the edges, while Amy, for the first time since arriving, actually looked up from her of proportion. "There's no reason to drag this out any further. You've made your point. Okay, let's just put this behind us." Ethan let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he watched them struggle to regain control of the situation. "Put this behind us," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You stole from me for years. You put me in debt. You used my name, my success, my hard work, and now that it's finally caught up to you, you think a few empty words are going to make me forget it?" Rebecca, who had been standing silently up until this point, suddenly snapped, turning on her husband with a ferocity that surprised even Ethan. "You said you had it under control, Mark," she hissed, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You promised me that this wouldn't come back to bite us, and now look at us. We have nothing, because you were too greedy, too reckless, too goddamn arrogant to think this would ever catch up to you." Mark recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his eyes darting toward Amy, who had been watching the entire exchange in silence, her face unreadable. For years, Amy had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their parents' eyes, the one who had benefited the most from their manipulations. But now, standing in the middle of the ruins of their family's legacy, even Amy couldn't pretend that this wasn't exactly what they deserved. "Was I just a pawn in your game?" Amy finally asked, her voice quiet but filled with something Ethan had never heard from her before: disillusionment, betrayal, maybe even regret. "Did you ever actually care about me, or was I just another excuse to keep taking and lying until there was nothing left?" Mark and Rebecca opened their mouths to respond, but for the first time in their lives, no words came. They had nothing left to say, no defense to offer, no more lies to spin. As the weight of everything they had done finally settled on their shoulders, the fight drained from them completely. Ethan didn't bother waiting for whatever pathetic excuse they might try to muster. He had wasted enough of his life waiting for this family to see him, to respect him, to treat him as something more than a resource to be exploited. Now, as he reached into his bag and pulled out the final nail in their coffin, he felt nothing but satisfaction. He stepped forward and dropped the thick envelope onto the coffee table, letting the sound of the papers hitting the wood echo through the silent room. Mark frowned hesitantly, reaching for it, his fingers trembling as he pulled out the letter on top. His eyes scanned the words, his face going pale as the reality of what he was reading hit him like a freight train. "Effective immediately," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost conversational, as he watched Mark's hand shake. "The bank is repossessing the house due to outstanding debts and fraudulent loan activity. Turns out, when you build a life on lies, eventually everything comes crashing down." Rebecca let out a strangled gasp, snatching the papers from Mark's hands as if she could will the words to change just by looking at them harder. Amy exhaled sharply, running a hand down her face, the full weight of the situation settling in. Mark and Rebecca just sat there, shoulders slumped, looking like people who had finally realized that they had lost everything. Ethan turned toward the door, not bothering to wait for whatever desperate pleas they might try to throw at him. He had heard enough, seen enough, lived through enough to know that nothing they said would change the past, and frankly, he didn't care. As he stepped out onto the front porch, Sarah was already waiting, her expression unreadable but her eyes filled with something that looked suspiciously like pride. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, letting the last remnants of his past drift away with it. Then, with one final glance over his shoulder at the house that had never truly felt like home, he smirked, shaking his head as he muttered the words that would linger in the ruins of his family's shattered world. "Funny," he said, his voice light, almost amused. "Turns out, I was the only one keeping this family afloat, of proportion. There's no reason to drag this out any further. You've made your point. Okay, let's just put this behind us." Ethan let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he watched them struggle to regain control of the situation. "Put this behind us," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You stole from me for years. You put me in debt. You used my name, my success, my hard work, and now that it's finally caught up to you, you think a few empty words are going to make me forget it?" Rebecca, who had been standing silently up until this point, suddenly snapped, turning on her husband with a ferocity that surprised even Ethan. "You said you had it under control, Mark," she hissed, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You promised me that this wouldn't come back to bite us, and now look at us. We have nothing, because you were too greedy, too reckless, too goddamn arrogant to think this would ever catch up to you." Mark recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his eyes darting toward Amy, who had been watching the entire exchange in silence, her face unreadable. For years, Amy had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their parents' eyes, the one who had benefited the most from their manipulations. But now, standing in the middle of the ruins of their family's legacy, even Amy couldn't pretend that this wasn't exactly what they deserved. "Was I just a pawn in your game?" Amy finally asked, her voice quiet but filled with something Ethan had never heard from her before: disillusionment, betrayal, maybe even regret. "Did you ever actually care about me, or was I just another excuse to keep taking and lying until there was nothing left?" Mark and Rebecca opened their mouths to respond, but for the first time in their lives, no words came. They had nothing left to say, no defense to offer, no more lies to spin. As the weight of everything they had done finally settled on their shoulders, the fight drained from them completely. Ethan didn't bother waiting for whatever pathetic excuse they might try to muster. He had wasted enough of his life waiting for this family to see him, to respect him, to treat him as something more than a resource to be exploited. Now, as he reached into his bag and pulled out the final nail in their coffin, he felt nothing but satisfaction. He stepped forward and dropped the thick envelope onto the coffee table, letting the sound of the papers hitting the wood echo through the silent room. Mark frowned hesitantly, reaching for it, his fingers trembling as he pulled out the letter on top. His eyes scanned the words, his face going pale as the reality of what he was reading hit him like a freight train. "Effective immediately," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost conversational, as he watched Mark's hand shake. "The bank is repossessing the house due to outstanding debts and fraudulent loan activity. Turns out, when you build a life on lies, eventually everything comes crashing down." Rebecca let out a strangled gasp, snatching the papers from Mark's hands as if she could will the words to change just by looking at them harder. Amy exhaled sharply, running a hand down her face, the full weight of the situation settling in. Mark and Rebecca just sat there, shoulders slumped, looking like people who had finally realized that they had lost everything. Ethan turned toward the door, not bothering to wait for whatever desperate pleas they might try to throw at him. He had heard enough, seen enough, lived through enough to know that nothing they said would change the past, and frankly, he didn't care. As he stepped out onto the front porch, Sarah was already waiting, her expression unreadable but her eyes filled with something that looked suspiciously like pride. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, letting the last remnants of his past drift away with it. Then, with one final glance over his shoulder at the house that had never truly felt like home, he smirked, shaking his head as he muttered the words that would linger in the ruins of his family's shattered world. "Funny," he said, his voice light, almost amused. "Turns out, I was the only one keeping this family afloat."